You hopefully most of you got our notice about the Birdathon. The catalog went out a few weeks ago and should be in your mailbox by now. This is the Birdathon is our biggest fundraiser of the year, and there are tons of fun ways to participate. You can sign up for one of our special Birdathon adventure trips. The registration begins on Friday, February 28th, so you've got another week before that kicks in, but you can check out all the offerings online now. We've started our early bird auction. We have a very special trip to the Rocky Mountains with Steve and Viviana. If you haven't met them, they do Sierra trips for us. They do. They're amazing educators. They're fantastic birders, and this is a really fantastic trip up into the Rocky Mountains to see the birds of the Rockies. And this is like the best way to do it. And it's everything is included, so you don't have to think about it even. Find that link and on our website, and I hope you'll bid on it so that we can raise lots of money to protect birds. Also coming up next week is our the Friends and Family and Bay Birding Challenge fundraising orientation. So if you're interested in forming a team or doing some just your own, friends and family fundraising to help raise money to protect birds, we'd be thrilled to have you join us. It's really a lot of fun. You can plan your own big day, or you can participate in a more competitive one. And I'm going to turn this over to Eric from our travel desk to tell you a little bit about upcoming travel opportunities.
Great, thanks, Glenn. 2024, things were not quite normal still. We were still in a bit of post-pandemic travel uncertainty, and things have really, I think, settled down. So much so that almost all of our offerings for 2025 are full for the year, with a couple of exceptions. We are getting ready to collect money for our November Bhutan trip, and we've had a cancellation. And this is our standard 18-day trip. We've added a day on that one, though, to visit the famous Crane Festival on November 12th. So if you're interested in that, drop us an email quickly, because somebody's going to snap up that last spot. And we added a second section of our popular Brazil and Argentina trip. That date is wrong. It's October 17th through 29th. And it's not only got a lot of birds, you go to the Atlantic forest as well as the Pantanal, but some really great mammals as well. It's the best place in the world to see jaguars. I've been on the trip twice and seen many, many jaguars. We've got almost everything for 2026 posted. We're going back to India, and that's another trip that features a lot of great mammals. India is the only place in the world where you can see lions and tigers, because of the Asiatic lion is extinct everywhere else. We've got a new Costa Rica trip, and then we are running some old favorites. We're running Alaska again with Wild Latitudes, and Mark Preddy is back leading a trip for us to Oaxaca. We're doing Southern California deserts again with Ivan and Wild Latitudes. We ran our first trip there without Eddie and Noreen this year, and it was a big success. Ivan does a great job there. He's originally from Southern California. And of course, we're doing Araucana Lodge, and we're going to do the Andes extension again next winter. So if you want to get some nice weather in South America, you can check those out. And we've just finally got our spring warblers trip posted. We're doing that in Ohio, springtime. And it's a chance to see all of the warblers that you can see in the USA in one trip. We're going to Cuba this year, and we don't quite have that posted yet. We'll have it up soon. And this year, for the first time, we ran an owl trip in Minnesota. It was the first one filled up so fast, we added the second one. They were both hugely successful. I don't know if any of you were listening to NPR today. They did a feature on owls in Minnesota because it's an eruption year, and they're having a lot of trouble with owls and automobiles. So I hope that gets sorted out. And I hope next year the owls are as good as they were this year, because they saw all of their targets this year. Extremely, extremely good owling this year. So that's what's happening with the travel desk. And go and look at the pages yourself. And if you're interested in something, drop us an email. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Just a heads up that next month we've got Julie Thayer, who is a biologist working at Alcatraz Island, coming to talk with us about Alcatraz and its and how climate is affecting the seabird nesting colonies there. It's a really interesting story, and she's a great speaker, so this should be a lot of fun. And if you haven't been out there to see them, you should make a point of doing that. We have a couple of trips coming up this summer. And with that, I've got to the end of our announcements. So we will now turn it over to Trina for her talk. Let me get rid of my share here and go ahead.
Okay, I forgot to share my audio that first time, so make sure we'll get that going. Alrighty, so just to double check, can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Awesome. All right, and so if I've got the green light. Yeah, so thank you guys so much for coming out to listen to my talk today. My name is Trina Chou. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I'm really excited to kind of talk to you about the behavioral research side of things. And so the long title of my talk is London Ear, Using Behavioral Research in Neuroscience to Study Hearing in Songbirds. So first of all, a little bit of a background of where I'm from and why I've even been invited here in the first place. I'm actually born and raised in the South Bay area in Sunnyvale, California. And my interest in animals started with my family pets, or my cats, who are pictured here. For my undergraduate degree, I then went to Vassar College, which is in upstate New York, and I graduated just about 2 years ago as both a neuroscience and behavior major and a math minor. And so here is where I turned my love for animals into a love for actually doing research with animals, as I joined a lab my sophomore year during sensory ecology in Songbirds in Dr. Megan Gall's lab. And so now I'm actually a second-year PhD student at the University of Tennessee. I'm studying in their ecology and evolutionary biology department in Dr. Jesse Tanner's lab, and I'm really interested in just acoustic communication in general. But of course, I'm speaking to the Golden Gate Bird Alliance, and so today I'll be kind of talking about that research that I did as an undergraduate studying birds. And I know you guys are interested in birds, and here's my current study system. But I also wanted to show a picture of my current cat who loves birds as well. So yeah. So first of all, I'm sure, again, all of us are interested in birds, but I'm actually going to give a brief introduction of kind of the topics and the questions that I think about in terms of doing my research and conducting my research. So I'm really interested in the field of acoustic communication, or the way that animals are communicating with one another acoustically using sounds. There's lots of different scenarios and contexts that animals might communicate with one another, but at its most basic, you can kind of think of two individuals, such as a male who is then singing a song for a female, right? So that male is using this song to potentially attract the female as a mate. In the context of the way that I think about research, I typically think of it with these terms, where there's a signaler who's producing a signal that's meant to alter something about a receiver's behavior. Now, animals aren't just communicating in pure silence, right? Oftentimes, their signals also have to travel through the environment that they live in. And this environment can actually impact the way that this communication happens and the way that signalers and receivers interact with one another. Animals live in a wide variety of environments, right? Just like us humans. There's many different environments that exist in this world, and each of these environments can actually have different soundscapes. They sound different just because of things such as the background noise, right? Background noise can vary from place to place, from environment type to environment type. So it's important to think about the kinds of soundscapes that animals are dealing with in the wild and how these things might affect the evolution of like the way that they process signals. So for example, birds that live in the middle of a very crowded city are going to experience something very different than birds that live in an uncrowded, quiet backyard. And this is true of not just birds, but many other animals, so including frogs, crickets, and even bats. that are encountering these different environments despite being, same animals and same kinds of species. And so another big pressure of kind of thinking this environment and what's in the environment has actually been anthropogenic or human noise. So human activities, particularly things like traffic noise and construction noise, can actually increase and change the composition of sound within a soundscape. And so as researchers, a lot of what we're interested is trying to understand how this relatively new-ish kind of pressure of anthropogenic noise is going to affect the way that animals naturally communicate with one another. So there's a couple ways that we can try to do this. The first one is kind of looking at how anthropogenic noise kind of affects the environment itself and affects the way that signals travels through this environment. So for example, if you're thinking about a bird call, right, think about how it might travel differently through a, super quiet forest or in the middle of a busy city. You can also look at how anthropogenic noise is going to affect the signalers and the kind of sounds that these signalers are producing. And so I figured we'd go into this a little bit more. So what you're seeing here is basically a visual representation of song. So this graph that you see on the left is what's called a spectrogram, right? Where you have time on the x-axis, frequency on the y-axis, and those kind of dark little spots are actually a call. So in this case, it's actually the song of a chickadee, right? So they give a phi, b of two little tones, and that's what you're looking at right there. And then on the y-axis, you see what's called a power spectrum. So now it's like you've taken a slice of that first graph and turned it on its side, and you're looking at which frequencies are kind of the most prevalent in this call. And so this is what a chickadee song might sound like in complete silence, right? Very easy to visually see. Now, what you're looking at in these kind of next two graphs are all this gray that's been introduced is actually traffic noise now, or anthropogenic noise. So traffic and anthropogenic noise tends to happen in that lower kilohertz range. And as you can see, especially on the left with those spectrograms, this noise overlaps quite a bit with the ranges that a lot of birds are using for their songs and calls. And so a noise can have this potentially very detrimental effect to the way that birds are able to, produce songs, hear each other, and all sorts of stuff. So the impact of noise on signalers has been pretty well studied over the past few decades. And so these are just a few titles from some articles from some peer-reviewed journals that look at the anthropogenic noise effects. And for the most part, they're pretty negative, right? So kind of in summary, a lot of these signalers tend to increase the frequency of their song in response to noise, although this could also be a byproduct of them just increasing the amplitude or increasing how loud they're singing these songs. But a lot of the effects of anthropogenic noise that are kind of tied with urban diversity or urban areas has been a decrease in general songbird diversity. So ultimately, noise is kind of having some pretty negative effects on these signalers. A cool example that I thought I'd walk through with you guys is a project that was conducted and published in Science magazine called Singing in a Silent Spring. Birds respond to a half-century soundscape reversion during the COVID-19 shutdown, which was actually carried out and directed by Dr. Elizabeth Derryberry, who is actually one of my advisors here at UTK. I highly recommend you give it a read if you'd like. It's pretty short. But part of the reason I wanted to talk about this is because they study this white-crowned sparrow and their songs, and they study them in the San Francisco Bay Area. So they've been going to this kind of field site for many, many years now and going out and collecting data from the different white-crowned sparrows that live in this area, collecting data on their songs, on the noise levels, and all sorts of things like that. So what you're looking at is both their kind of what they've classified as their rural sites in blue and their urban sites in red. And because they've been looking at this data set for years, an interesting happened during the COVID-19 pandemic in about 2020, where everything kind of shut down. And as a kind of result of that, a lot of anthropogenic noise levels also went down. So they were basically investigating the effects that this now all of a sudden lack of noise is having on the white-crowned sparrows. And so first, what happened to the noise, right? So what we're looking at this graph is before and then during the COVID-19 shutdown. Again, the red is kind of in those urban areas and the blue is in the rural areas. And what we're looking at here is just background noise levels. So you can see, especially in those urban areas, they're experiencing now, once there's a COVID shutdown, a decrease in kind of the general noise levels. And this is probably almost directly attributed to now a lack of traffic. And so now what you're looking at is over the years, this is actually traffic flow taken from the Golden Gate Bridge and the average number of vehicles per day in thousands, starting in 1937, going all the way until 2020. And then in the year 2020, you can see they've plotted the months to show you how this dramatic decrease in the amount of traffic is happening. And it's returning to levels not seen since the 1950s, basically, which is really interesting to think about. And so not only is the general kind of noise levels decreasing, but if you take a look at the specific frequencies at which this noise is decreasing at, right? So now we're looking at frequency on the x-axis, noise level on the y-axis. You can see particularly within that 1 to 4 kilohertz range, which is again where a lot of bird songs are happening basically, you see this really dramatic decrease in those urban areas where urban areas are experiencing these decreases in noise, particularly in the ranges that songbirds are going to use. So how did the birds actually react? Right? So again, we're looking at before and then during the pandemic. And now what you're seeing on the y-axis is minimum frequency. So as I said before, one of the responses that signalers or birds will do in response to noise is increase their frequency. And so kind of as you might expect, once you remove that pressure of noise, they actually found that these birds are now decreasing their minimum frequency, especially in those urban areas, right? So it's almost like by taking away that pressure of anthropogenic noise, these birds are kind of making their songs go back into those lower frequencies. And so why does this matter? Well, minimum frequency and frequency in general is something that in these tree sparrows are used as a measure of vocal performance. So with these birds, right, they have bandwidths of these calls that they make, and the lower, like the lower frequency they can make their songs at, the wider the bandwidth they can call at, basically. And when they're able to widen their bandwidth, they actually can increase their vocal performance or show to mates, hey, I can do kind of more impressive calls. So using this measure of vocal performance, Liz and her team basically found that when anthropogenic noise is reduced during that COVID-19 shutdown, that these white-crowned tree sparrows, again, in these urban areas, were able to increase their vocal performance. So just kind of a cool little like counterexample of thinking how anthropogenic noise does have negative effects and how when you remove that noise, you get these cool increases in these vocal performances. So I've spent a lot of time telling you now how noise affects signalers, but importantly, noise can also affect the receivers and the hearing. And this third bit is kind of where my research is most interested in, and has also been very classically understudied compared to the effect of noise on signalers. And so it's not completely clear how receivers are responding to noise. So there's been a little bit of research so far that noise continues to have detrimental effects, including things like decreased song recognition by females and a decrease in the effectiveness of territory marking, especially since things like songs and calls are used in that function. But there still remain a lot of unanswered questions about how noise is going to affect the receivers. So this is where we now get to start going into my research and understanding the birds that I study and the behavior that I use to kind of ask the questions of interest. So here are the 3 birds that me and my lab study. So they're black-capped chickadees, tufted titmice, and white-breasted nuthatches. And there's a standard assumption that just in general that all birds are kind of doing things like hearing the same way and that all their hearing is going to be affected similarly by noise. However, this is potentially not true. And so these 3 songbirds offer a great model system for understanding how noise might impact communication kind of differentially across species. Because not only do, for example, chickadees communicate with chickadees, but they also communicate with the other species. So chickadees, titmice, and nuthatch will all communicate with one another and are all kind of have interest in listening to the calls and signals of the 3 others. So I'm going to be now playing their calls. So first, we're going to hear the call of a black-capped chickadee. And so as you can see, this is a spectrogram. So I saw in the chat that, yeah, so frequency does refer to pitch, basically. Frequency is kind of like the technical measure, but yes, it's a measure of the pitch. And so you can see these chickadees have these stereotyped chickadee-dee-dee-dee calls, right, that they make. Next up is the titmouse call. right? So it's kind of got that similar shape and structure, but as you can see, they're all on kind of the same y-axis. These titmouse calls are just a little bit of a higher frequency than the chickadees. And finally, you have the white-breasted nuthatch calls. So these nuthatches have a very different kind of call, and as you'll notice, kind of much lower frequencies than the other two birds. And kind of anecdotally as well, the nuthatches tend to be the quietest ones. So when you're out in the field, the nuthatches are kind of doing soft little, what they're called quinks, while the chickadees and the titmice are kind of just going crazy a lot of the time. So the great thing about these three species is that they form mixed species flocks during the winter and non-breeding seasons. And in these kind of groups, they'll actually engage in predator mobbing behavior. So chickadees and titmice in particular, if they see a predator that's dangerous to them, they will utter an alarm call, give alarm vocalizations, and will warn both their own species as well as the other two species that there's a predator in the area. And when they do that, they actually can get a whole group of individuals to come together to chase off a predator, to collectively harass and mob this predator to kind of entice it to leave. So what I'm going to show here is just a little bit of a hawk, actually, that's kind of being mobbed by chickadees. And you'll hear both. There's an anti-predator response that's kind of actual physical approaches where there's chickadees kind of flying around. And then there's also a lot of alarm calls, right? So there's a bunch of alarm calls uttered by several individuals. So I'll play a little bit of this video. So yeah, so that's just one of kind of the actual seeing how this mobbing behavior works. And so kind of tying now the study system back to my acoustic communication, my big research question is basically wondering how anthropogenic noise is going to affect the behavior of these three species in particular, in relation to the anti-predator behaviors and this mobbing behavior that they do. So previous work in our lab has already kind of tested some very basic, simple approaches. So our lab tends to use what's called playback studies, where we actually go out into the wild and we will, from a speaker, playback recordings that we've taken from the field and measure behavior to those recordings. So what you're looking at here, on the x-axis is kind of different playback types, and on the y-axis is the mean number of platform approaches, which we're kind of using as a proxy to understand this mobbing behavior of wanting to collectively group together. And so the different playback types are basically a mobbing call by itself, anthropogenic noise by itself, and then a mixed playback of the two of them combined, right? So what you can see is that both chickadees and titmice, whatever they normally respond to with the mobbing call, they actually decrease those responses, particularly the titmice, in the presence of anthropogenic noise. So noise is actually affecting the behavior, right? But it's kind of unclear as to why is this happening, right? There are several explanations. And so this led to me basically proposing to our lab, hey, let's come up with an experiment to test why we see this reduction in responses. And especially as you can see, there's already some difference in species responses here. So, as I said, there's a couple hypotheses that could explain why these behaviors are reduced. The first one is this concept of masking, where basically anthropogenic noise masks the signal of interest or basically overlaps with the signal and makes it harder to hear, right? So as I was kind of showing the spectrograms, that region of traffic noise overlaps quite a bit with the song. So maybe it's overlapping so much that they can't even hear it. And so this is occurring primarily in the acoustic domain, right? They're both things that affect your hearing. There's actually an alternative hypothesis too, called the distraction hypothesis. And this one kind of describes that noise is just distracting, right? Noise in itself might be competing with other ecologically relevant stimuli for attention. So for example, I'm sure many of you have experienced this where you're having a long drive home, you turn up the volume on your radio or your podcast or whatever you're listening to, you finally get home and you go to park or turn down the street and you turn down the volume in your car, right? There's really no reason as to why this music, which is acoustic, should affect your visual perception of being able to park, but it basically is a form of distraction, right? That may increase your overall cognitive load. And so this is one, right, that spans multiple sensory domains. It's not going to be just limited to the kind of auditory or acoustic domain. And so how can we distinguish between these two, right? How can we get at what's actually happening in our birds? Because both of them are going to lead to reduced anti-predator behavior. Well, before we start answering that question, a cool thing about chickadees and their calls first is that chickadees have actually been found to be able to encode information about predator threat in their calls. And so what you're looking at here on the x-axis is predator wingspan, right? So these are basically each individual point represents a potential predator of chickadees. And what you see on the y-axis is number of D notes per call. Right, so the greater the axis, the more D notes there are. And so the direct predators of these chickadees and other small songbirds are actually these smaller birds, such as the saw-whet owls and pygmy owls, who can maneuver really well in the branches that they hang out in. And so a chickadee is also going to be a much bigger meal for a small owl than it is, for example, a big falcon. So what you see here is that basically for those really, really dangerous predators, chickadees are actually uttering more D notes in their calls. So that means the difference between a chickadee dee 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 call versus like a chickadee dee. And other individuals can listen to these calls, basically listen for how long these D notes are going, and kind of understand the danger level of the predator that they are, is present in the environment. And so because chickadees do this, we can kind of utilize this really cool system to test these hypotheses, where what we can do is kind of present chickadees with either a mobbing call, right, in which a certain level of predator threat is encoded in that call, or we can present them with an actual physical mount. And so they're going to represent the same level of threat. So what you're looking at here is our physical representation of our mock saw-whet owl, affectionately nicknamed Raoul or Raoul. And so basically we are either going to present Raoul or a mobbing call, both with and without noise, and see what the responses are. And so kind of with its design, right, since masking only occurs in the acoustic domain, if noise is affecting behavior due to masking, then it's going to decrease responses to that acoustic stimuli of the chickadee call, but not to the visual stimuli. However, if distractions at play of noise is just generally distracting, it's going to affect responses no matter what. So we kind of expect to see decreases in behavior in both domains. And so we can measure both things like approaches, but we can also measure things about their calls, so just how many calls they're giving, and particularly, right, the number of notes per calls, or how dangerous they think this is happening. So this study took place at the Vassar Farm and Ecological Preserve, which we're lucky enough to have at Vassar. That's part of our campus. It's located just about a 10-minute walk from the main body of campus and spans about 1,000 acres. And so there are known populations of chickadees, titmice, and nuthatches that have been living here for a long time now. And so for many years, we've had these little wooden platforms that you see on the right that are our baiting platforms that we stock year-round with black oil sunflower seed to encourage the birds to kind of come to our platforms as a food source, particularly kind of around those winter months when all the bugs start to go away. So this video I'm about to play for you is a video that I actually took myself from my own phone with a chickadee coming and taking a seed soon after I had baited a platform. So a fun little story is that with these smaller songbirds, they take their seeds and they go open them or they go eat them elsewhere. So you'll see them flying kind of back and forth between a branch and a platform. And so that's how you can actually tell whether, if you've baited a platform and check on it several days, whether you've had the birds of interest or not. Because if all the seeds are gone, it means these chickadees are kind of flying to and from. But if your seed is left with a bunch of empty shells, it was probably more likely a bigger bird, such as like a blue jay or a cardinal, that basically just sat at your platform and could just march away. So in terms of back to our experiment, right, this is just a quick little diagram of kind of what we did. So we have these central feeding platforms that we have as our centralized locations. Just to its right, we either present them with the owl mount or place some chickadee calls, and then we are recording the vocalizations they're doing, as well as having observers who are observing the approaches to that platform, and basically in these kind of concentric circles that we set up with the flags. And so again, we are measuring the number of approaches, we have traffic noise in half of our trials, and we're recording what's going on in these experiments. And so we take all this data, we spent a whole semester analyzing, okay, what was going on and what did we find, right? So for chickadees, we found that their calling behavior, right? So things like the number of calls, the number of notes per calls actually decreased to both visual and acoustic stimuli in the presence of noise, right? So this suggests that their response may have been modulated by distraction specifically. Nuthatches, on the other hand, only decrease their calling behavior in response to the acoustic stimuli, but not the visual stimuli, which kind of seems to suggest that their behavior in particular is being modulated by masking. And titmice, on the other hand, seem to show actually no changes in behavior response, right? So this may indicate that kind of they're not affected by our low levels of noise. So this was really cool in itself, right? We're kind of throwing away that assumption that all species are behaving differently or that they all behave the same in noise, because we have 3 species here that seem to display these different responses. But again, my question is, why? Why do we see this difference? What is probably driving these patterns? And so, as a neuroscience and behavior major, I was kind of like, well, maybe there's a neuroscience component to this. And so now we turn to the neuroscience part of the talk. And so specifically, we can try to explain these differences we see based on their behavior, based on their auditory processing or the hearing systems, the actual physiological hearing systems of these birds. And not very much is known about them at all in terms of their abilities to hear signals throughout noise. So this is what I chose to focus on for my senior thesis at Vassar. So how can you even assess hearing? There's a couple ways when you're just trying to understand baseline auditory system. So for example, we can try to look at understanding what makes sounds detectable. So if you're trying to recruit individuals to mob, you want birds from far away to be able to detect the sound of your call. And so we'll first talk about thresholds, or basically what's the softest sound that's required to elicit a response from our birds. So how do we measure this? Well, we can measure this using auditory evoked potentials, right? We unfortunately can't go up to a songbird and just ask, hey, can you hear this sound or not? And this is also similar of newborn babies. So we can use this technique called auditory evoked potentials that's commonly used with other organisms that can't talk, right? And so we can actually test the peripheral auditory system and playing auditory signals, or in this case, tones, to evoke these neural responses in the case of action potentials, and measure those potentials to understand how the neurons in this auditory nerve are firing in response to our tones. So for my work, which I conducted kind of during the spring of my senior year, I would basically catch birds from our farm, run our experiments, and then return them back to the farm. And so what we would do is we would put electrodes, one right over the ear, one at the head, and one at the back of the neck, to measure these auditory nerve impulses as we were playing them sounds. So this is what our experiment setup would look like, right? So it's taking place in this really big anechoic or sound deadening chamber, hence all the black kind of foam padding you see in the back. The black sphere at the top of this picture is actually our speaker, and we place our bird in a cage that's kind of meant to block out all the electrical signals, so we can really get a good reading of what's going on with the neural activity. And we start by playing them tones from the speaker, starting really, really loud and getting softer and softer and softer. And so the point at which this auditory system stops responding or stops detecting that sound is considered the threshold. So real quick, I have some audio of playing you what a tone actually sounds like. And so what you'll hear is it'll kind of play twice, and then it lowers and decreases in sound level. So that's what the birds are listening to in that chamber. It sounds very robotic, but basically it's a bunch of tones at a very specific frequency. And since we're interested in how noise affects these auditory capabilities, we do the same thing, but we play these tones with white noise in the background. And so this is what it sounds like in noise. So even for us humans, you can tell that that tone gets kind of harder to hear in that noise, right? As that tone gets softer and softer. And so the thresholds that we find in these noise levels are what we call mass thresholds. So we're specifically measuring, right, the auditory brainstem response, which is basically this kind of summed response of the auditory nerve to the onset of sound. So we're looking at this general response of a bunch of neurons to when the ear picks up on a sound. And so the bigger this ABR or this response is, right, which you can see by kind of this peak and then this valley and back to fluctuation, the bigger the neural response is. So it indicates that a larger number of neurons are being recruited to respond. And so this kind of ABR shape in particular is in response to a pretty loud tone, which starts right at that red arrow. And so the little time it takes for a response to happen is the time it takes for all the neurons to process what's going on. And so what you can see here is starting from the top, this is the response to a tone played at 60 decibels, and then slowly getting softer and softer and softer. And right, so what you can see is that shape. First of all, it shifts a little bit to the right, right? So it takes a little bit more time for it to get processed. It also decreases in amplitude, so it gets shallower and shallower and shallower. And at some point, the shape goes away entirely, right? So then this is what we'd call the threshold of around 12.5 to 15 dB. It's just about the threshold for what this bird in particular can hear, or the softest this bird can hear it at. And so what does this actually kind of look like? So what we did is we're looking at what's now called an audiogram, where again, we have frequencies on the x-axis. So we played them tones of 5 different frequencies. And we looked at what's that threshold? What's the softest sound that they can hear? And so this is what the black-capped chickadees look like, right? So the smaller the threshold, right, the closer you are, the shorter it is, basically, the better your sensitivity, right? If you can hear something at 20 dBs, for example, versus 40, it means your hearing system is much more sensitive at that 20. So this is what our chickadees look like. Then our titmice, and then our nuthatches, right? And so a couple things you'll notice, there's kind of this general U shape, right? Which for birds makes sense because there's kind of this auditory coupling where the frequencies at which their songs are in are kind of the frequencies that their hearing is best tuned to. So, right, we're again in that 1 to 4 range, hence you see this U shape. And you also see that these nuthatches kind of have the best sensitivities because they have the lowest thresholds, and this is in complete silence. And so what happens when we play just a little bit of noise in the background, right? So at a low level of noise here, this is kind of the equivalent to the sounds you might hear when you're just walking around a nature preserve, because there's always stuff going on. And so as you can see, these thresholds are increasing, which makes sense because in general, noise makes it harder to hear softer sounds. But interesting enough, you see this really big jump in the nuthatch responses in particular, right? So while in quiet, they had the best sensitivity. All of a sudden, you introduce a little bit of noise, and they now have the worst sensitivities of the 3 birds. This is also true with a slightly louder level of noise, right? You again see this increase in thresholds, but there's a disproportionate increase in the nuthatch thresholds. And again, in a very loud level of noise, which is kind of equivalent to being right next to traffic noise, right? So this trend continues on, and now these nuthatches, right, have the highest thresholds, particularly in these noise. So our thresholds are basically telling us that, yes, there are these really big species level differences in the way that the auditory systems are able to detect sounds and noise. And particularly, these nuthatches seem to be really, really bad as soon as a little bit of noise is introduced. And so to kind of continue on these findings, all right, is another method of understanding detection, especially in noise, is to understand what are called critical ratios. And so what are critical ratios? Basically, the critical ratio is how much louder a signal has to be than the noise it's being kind of played in to be detectable. So in order to calculate critical ratios, you take the thresholds, right, that you measure, and you subtract the noise level to understand, okay, how much louder does my threshold need to be over the noise in order for it to be detectable? So just to kind of show you an image, right? It's how much louder does that signal have to be over the masking sound to get that critical ratio. And so just to visually show it, right? So this is very similar to the graph I was just showing you, right? This is the titmice, the three mass thresholds. That sound is getting louder and louder, right? And so when you're just looking at, for example, that low noise condition, you can look at that difference between the noise level, which is the dashed line on the bottom, as well as the thresholds. And then you can do this for each of the different levels of noise. So now looking at the medium kind of level of noise, same thing. You take that threshold and understand kind of how much louder it has to be than the background noise. Right. And so finally for the highest level of noise. And so what you'll kind of notice is that the magnitude of these three differences or these three arrows is about the same for each of the different frequencies. And so it's kind of the critical ratio is great because the critical ratio is kind of independent of how loud your noise is, right? No matter how loud your noise is, the threshold is always going to be a consistent level above that. And so this is just another way to measure basically how good are you at processing things in noise, where the higher your critical ratio is, the worse you are, right? The louder a tone has to be in order for you to actually detect it, right? So similar, just like thresholds, smaller thresholds indicate better sensitivities. You're better at picking up these small sounds. Smaller critical ratios also indicate better sensitivity, right? And so we see this very kind of similar pattern across our birds where our nuthatches have the worst critical ratios. Chickadees are kind of right in the middle, and nuthatches have the worst critical ratio. I'm getting my birds mixed up. Nuthatches have the worst critical ratios. Titmice have this lowest, and they're also still kind of experiencing this U shape. Right, so noise seems to be particularly detrimental to these nuthatches, which kind of lines up with the things we've seen so far. So I've talked a lot about detection, right, and how detection is affected by noise. But another aspect of hearing that we can look to understand is about discrimination, right? So it's almost like step two. When sounds are really loud, how are they being discriminated or how are they being processed? And we can look at what are the ABR amplitudes, basically, to understand more about the neuronal response to noise that they can hear. So when we play sounds that are well above their thresholds, when we play really loud sounds, we can get these really reliable responses, right? And so these ABRs basically is kind of the general response of these summed units, and we can compare this response across species. So what you're seeing here is basically a really loud tone. We play it for all three species of birds, and this is the ABR response we get. Then you can kind of look at the same thing, but with a little bit of background noise, and then another little bit of background noise, and finally the really loud background noise. And so again, you kind of see this difference that's across these species where these nuthatches are getting flattened out kind of way faster than the other two species are. And so we can quantitatively kind of look at this by measuring the difference between the peak and the kind of valley that's there. So we can actually measure what's the difference between these two things. And that's what's called the ABR amplitude, right? So again, what you're looking at is a amplitude on the y-axis with the different frequencies across our three species, right? And the greater that amplitude is, the greater the response is. So again, we have this kind of, now it's an opposite U shape because now bigger is better. But again, what you'll see is that as you introduce different levels of noise, right, these amplitudes are decreasing. The responses of these neurons are decreasing. and particularly with these nuthatches. So again, 60 dB, which is kind of the loudest, or I guess the loudest noise condition, is about pretty loud for these birds. And so nuthatches are going to be pretty detrimentally affected by these different levels of noise. So what's the conclusion? What's kind of the takeaway from all these things, right? Well, first of all, species are impacted differently. Not only did our 3 species seem to show these kind of different behavioral responses in our playback experiment, but these also line up almost exactly with their auditory capabilities, right? We found that these nuthatches were most susceptible to masking, and this kind of might be explained because their auditory system is actually most susceptible to noise, right? That when you introduce even a little bit of noise, the nuthatch auditory system just kind of freaks out, is unable to do what it usually does. And so that might be kind of the driver of why nuthatches responded differently in our behavioral experiments, right? So this is really cool to think about these kind of 3 different species, how they might kind of be affected by increasing levels of anthropogenic noise, by understanding how they might relate to kind of more urbanization. But for the researcher in me too, this is really cool because it means that there's aspects of this very simple underlying physiology, right, that may explain these more bigger complex behaviors. Auditory physiology is basically just literally what are the nerves doing, even when the bird's unconscious, right? Versus the behavior that we're measuring in our behavioral study is a much more complex full body organismal response. But yet we still see these same patterns that we observe in these kind of physiological patterns in their behavioral patterns. And so it's a really cool thing to think about, that we can maybe infer some things about behavior without having to go measure the behavior every single time, because critical ratios are actually a really easy and a non-invasive technique. And so it would be possible to basically get a bunch of different birds, especially if we wanted to do comparative work, and run a bunch of critical ratios to maybe make it some inferences about behavior that you might not necessarily be able to. And so where is this work going? What are kind of the future directions for it? Not all species are equal, right? More comparative work is definitely needed, considering the hearing of songbirds, especially as urbanization increases, anthropogenic noise increases, all sorts of things relating to noise. And it's kind of, we want to know how these different species are going to react differently. As I said, different techniques may give us different kinds of results, right? And these auditory evoked potentials are a great, fast, and non-invasive technique to collect data that may kind of offer us different insights into these behavioral data. And it has these big, important implications for understanding the behavior and potential resulting fitness in these increasing levels of anthropogenic noise. So still a lot of work to do in this field, which I think is pretty cool. And so with that, I know I'm finishing up a little early, but I wanted to give a special thanks to all the members of my lab while I was at the Gall Lab back at Vassar, right? So that's my advisor, Dr. Megan Gall, as well as all the many other fellow undergrads who helped out. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for lending an ear, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Why is mine not showing up here? Anyway, you can hear me, yes?
Yes, yes, I
Okay.
can.
I don't know why I've disappeared from the view, but oh, there we go. There we go. Now I'm back. All right. We have a couple of questions already. But um, if you have any other questions, please drop them in the chat. The first one is a question about what are the impact of the audio, what is AEP on, on the birds as a, is it traumatic for them?
Yeah, for sure. So that's a great question, and definitely great kind of something that we think about as bird researchers, is causing as little harm to the birds as we can. So before we can even conduct experiments, especially at the institution level, every university has what's called an Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, or IACUC, where before we even do our experiments, we have to give a really detailed protocol as to here's exactly what I'm doing, and here's how I'm going to reduce the harm to the animals that I'm working with. So we take a lot of precautions in that sense. But I can say our AEPs and ABRs are completely non-invasive, and the birds do completely fine. So, right, as I said, we take them from the farm into the lab. We house them temporarily for basically like less than 24 hours before releasing them later that day. And we also color band all of our birds so we can keep track, and we never run a bird more than twice. So we basically only make sure we run them once. And so because of that, right, so I'm going to go in the same locations over and over. And as I kept going to some of those same locations, towards the end of the field season, when I was trying to get certain species to make up for my numbers, I would recatch birds who I had already run experiments on. So it was cool because I'm like, okay, great, you're still alive. I'm glad this wasn't a traumatic enough process that you are still back at this platform that I caught you on. But I also was looking for more species to actually be working with. So for example, I was catching a lot of chickadees when I needed nuthatches. So it's kind of this double of like, yay, I'm happy you're here, but also go away so I can get more of your other friends. So it's not traumatic. We make sure none of our birds die. And as I said, we go through some very rigorous protocols to make sure that no harm comes to the birds.
There's a quick question from Aaron um, about their just migratory behavior. Do all three have similar migratory patterns?
Yeah,
Um,
so at least in our area, they don't really migrate per se. They kind of tend to stick in the same areas. And then, as I said, over the kind of winter slash non-breeding seasons, which happen from about, I want to say, like kind of December to March, April-ish is when they'll form these mixed species flocks. But then during the breeding season, which I think tends to happen a little bit closer to like April and June, is when they each will go to their own species and their nest cavities and so or their cavity nesters, and so then they don't do as much of the migratory stuff as maybe other birds do. But yeah.
um, Leslie asks, given the higher noise sensitivity of nuthatches, do they tend to avoid noisy environments more than the other two species?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's exactly what I was wondering too. So, when I was kind of doing my research and looking into these impacts, I did find one study that basically did a really big observational study. And it found that there were less nuthatches than chickadees and titmice in these more urban areas. But it's unclear whether it's, due to noise specifically or, with urban things comes a lot of aspects, right? Whether it's deforestation, defragmentation, there's light, there's blah, blah, blah. So it is definitely what I think is like, yeah, it's definitely possible that that's one of the reasons they might be avoiding urban soundscapes, but it's kind of hard to attribute it directly to noise.
Let's see. There's a bunch of good questions in here, so I want to make sure I don't miss any of them. Um, Yes, this is being recorded, and if you go to our website in the education section where the speakers, past speakers, it'll be there probably on Tuesday. So you can look for it there. In the chickadee graph, the D scale has halves, 1.5, 2.5. Do they really make half a D sound? Is that?
Hmm. I wonder which graph they're talking about. I mean, at least that I can say that they don't make half D now, D notes. But in terms of thinking about the graphs, for example, a lot of time we use kind of linear regressions to kind of extrapolate past the specific data points we have. Or for example, they're averaged over multiple chickadees. So it's possible one chickadee gave a three D notes, another did four, and that the average of the two is like 3.5 D notes. So I don't know which graph you might be specifically talking about, but a lot of times, right, we don't want to run experiments with just one chickadee, for example, because it could just be this one chickadee is really weird. So oftentimes, if it's not a whole number, it may be because it's being averaged over several individuals.
Let's see. I know there's one I missed in here. Sorry.
No, you're so good.
Any new research and results since you've graduated?
Yeah, so in terms of the timeline of when all this happened, so the behavioral research happened when I was in my junior year. And so our lab kind of collectively wrote and published a paper on it, which is out now. I think it's under, I'm the first author on it. So if you look up like Trina Chou, I believe it's called like interspecific differences and something something. If you look up anthropogenic noise and songbirds and my name, it'll probably pop up. And then the senior neuroscience project was solely me and my advisor. And so it recently actually got at least accepted with minor revisions into a journal because surprise, surprise, writing actually takes a long time, right? I collected the actual data back in the spring of 2023. And I've basically spent the past year and a half to 2 years, even though I'm now in grad school, writing up my results in an actual scientific manuscript. And so just submitted this past December, just heard back from our reviewers in past January. So I don't know too much about the research side of things, but at least I know in my scientific career, these results are finally getting published in a scientific manuscript, hopefully in the next couple months. So yeah.
Great. This is a fantastic question. Is there anything that we can do as as conservationists and birders to support birds in terms of noise pollution?
Yeah, for sure. It's one of those things that I think even just realizing that, noise around us is having these impacts of birds makes you think about them and their environments differently. And honestly, I think it's just generally about, being aware of that and also noticing not necessarily that, you should stop driving your car more often because like traffic is traffic and there's certain times it's necessary, but I think as birders, it's really nice to appreciate kind of the natural soundscapes that we do have and just like kind of general efforts to reduce the kind of secondhand impacts of things like urbanization and light pollution. Like I do think it is important at least to think about and recognize and just become more cognizant of the sounds around you, the environments that you're in. So unfortunately, I can't give a list of like, here's the actionable things you can do. But I think sometimes as part of being a birder, right now you're not only listening to the bird song itself, but now you might be listening to the environment and the direction that sound is traveling and things like that. So yeah.
Yeah. And I think there are actually, and if you keep an ear out for our action alerts, there in the next year or two, there will be a couple of opportunities to ensure that parks in this region, have that are critical for wildlife, have less disturbance than some of our parks do these days. And with electric bikes and that they're on the road now, there's just a lot more noise getting further into the wild spaces than there used to be. Um, let's see. Oh, this was a very good question. That some birds are much more tolerant of humans than others. Do you think that there may be some correlation between their human tolerance and their sound tolerance?
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. I personally don't know the answer, but of course, a lot of research has gone into like the personality of animals, right? Of whether individuals have certain personalities, because especially in like rats and mice, for example, some are way more adventurous and way more explorative. And I think that's also true of birds, where there have been studies that have found there are some individuals who are way more what's called, I think, like less risk averse, where they're more willing to explore novel areas. And so, although I like personally don't know specifically the answer to your question, there is most likely some sort of correlation between individuals who are kind of more likely to explore these new areas, and then with the correlation of noise. But it's hard to say exactly what direction it would go. And again, that's kind of at the individual level. So it's unclear whether some species as a whole have more, more adventurous birds than others, just because individual personality can vary so much. And so, yeah, but it's definitely an interesting field to think about. So,
I think we have time for one or two more questions. I just thought this was a really fascinating question that Steve asks, do electric cars are intentional noises for safety, right? They're actually significantly quiet. It is actually
yeah.
another, it's a side benefit from moving to electric cars is that there actually will be less noise pollution. But could the choice of frequency help lessen the impact on birds or other animals?
Yeah, no, that's a great question and a great point. And again, I haven't thought of that, but it definitely could, right? Because again, a lot of the effects of traffic particularly are kind of in that 1 to 4 kilohertz range. Um, I don't know if electric car noises in particular then make sounds outside of that frequency. But it would be an interesting thing to think about as how does the specific kind of composition of the noise that we're looking at affect these birds?
Um, So Richard asked a very interesting question, but I don't know that any of us here have the answer to it. Can birds tell if predators perching are full, having just eaten, or not? Um,
I'm
uh,
sure the chickadees would love to know, but I unfortunately don't think that they do. And so oftentimes it will be upon, usually at least for these specific birds, when they're giving alarm calls for the owls and stuff, they tend to make these calls when a predator's just perched as opposed to kind of soaring. And they'll utter it kind of the first sighting of what they see. So like, for example, with our predator mount, when we would present it physically as kind of a threat, we in like the fastest cases we get responses within seconds basically, where it's like, yeah, we previously had some flying in and they're maybe giving a little chickadee calls, and then as soon as they see that predator, like they're going crazy and bonkers and responding to our mount. So I don't know if they can really pick up on any indicators of the hunger status of their predators, but they typically utter these alarm calls kind of as soon as they see them.
but that could be a good project for a graduate student. So,
Yeah. To
or
make them
maybe an
moving down or
undergraduate.
something. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, Trina, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to learn more about your research, and it does definitely make me start thinking about, what we can do as a conservation organization to reduce noise pollution. I think it is noise and light pollution are two sort of big, outstanding impacts that we just don't pay enough attention to. We're working on our strategic plan, so we have to think about those issues as well. Um, so thank you so much. And look, you're please if you missed any of this, you're tune into our website in as I said on Monday or Tuesday, and the recording will be posted there in the speaker series section. Have a great evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. I'll say one last note. If you are interested in learning more about kind of the effects of anthropogenic noise, feel free to go to just like Google or Google Scholar, which has a bunch of research articles, because a bunch of people are also interested in this, have kind of looked into this, and a lot of them are kind of very public friendly because it's something that we're all interested in. Anthropogenic noise is such a hot topic. So if you're interested, feel free to Google more, and there's lots of more kind of specific research rabbit holes that you can go down.
Yeah, and write a blog post for us. I'd love to have it post on our so please, if you're interested, reach out to us. Reach out to Ryan. He's out of town at the moment, that's why he's not online with us today. But reach out to our office and say, hey, this is a really fascinating topic. I'd love to learn more, and we will connect you with resources and find the right place for you to share that. Um, have a great Clay's in the office. Those are actually photographs. This is how I know he's in the office because those are photographs. I think those might be Bob Lewis's photographs. I'm not sure. Um, anyway, but thank you all. Have a great evening, and we'll hopefully see many of you next month for our Alcatraz nesting birds lecture, and hope to see you out in the field. Have a great evening. Bye, everybody.